Hello once again at the Belgian Beer Brothers channel. Today we are going to talk about a beer that has, as usual, quite some history, because today we will have to talk about not one but two breweries. This beer was also the subject of some controversy because it's a fake trappist, but that will all become clear in a second. Because we are going to talk today about Witkap Pater. Witkap Pater, the name comes from the white hood, Witkap, white hood, that some friars wear during services, but I'm getting ahead of myself. First off, let's start with the original brewery, which is ironic because the later brewery was started earlier. But the original brewery that brewed Witkap was founded in 1919. Or I say founded, that's not quite true. In 1919, fermentation chemist Hendrik Verlinde, who literally wrote the book on fermentation, the fermentation handbook for breweries, he wrote that in 1916. But in 1919, he was an advisor for Alken, for Haagt, for the breweries in Mechelen, and later on he became an advisor for Westmalle, the real trappists. But in 1919 he bought brewery Drie Linden in Brasschaat in Antwerp, and that's actually about a 5-minute drive from where I am now. Doesn't exist anymore, but hey, spoiler alert. That was 1919, as I've said like 5 times already. In 1929, he names the beer that he's brewing Witkap, like I said, after the white hoods that friars wear. Some people think that Witkap is a reference to the white robes that the brothers in the abbey where it's brewed now wear, but that has nothing to do with it because this predates that by 50 years. So he renames the beer to Witkap, and in 1932 he even registers the phrase Witkap is trappistenbier, or Witkap is trappist beer, and the brothers from Westmalle Abbey actually sue him for this because trappist is a registered name and there are quite a few requirements to be able to use that name. However, because of the non-profit character of the monks of Westmalle, the judge actually rules in Hendrik's favor. Only in Belgium. So he's free to keep using that name, and actually there are I don't have one of those, but there are a bunch of glasses still to be found from that period with the phrase trappist, Witkap is trappist beer, because it was very, very common back in those days. Now in 1940 or the early 40s, unfortunately the brewery in Brasschaat is ruined by heavy bombardments, and even Hendrik Verlinde himself dies during one of those bombardments. But luckily his children rebuilt the brewery quite quickly. Then during the 60s the brewery is doing very well, and there are 5 variants of the Witkap beer. Unfortunately, in 1969, Raymond Verlinde, the son, dies as well, and the brewery is no longer in hands of the family. Apparently, some shifts happen, and in 1975 the brewery becomes property of a drinks trader in Deurne, which is also that way. He buys the brewery, but he decides that it's a bit too much work, and in 1979 he closes it down. Now he keeps the trademarks and the name Witkap, but he asks brewery Slaghmuylders in Ninove, which is the whole other side of the country, to brew it for him, which they do. Now, let's dive back into history, because the brewery Slaghmuylders is also a brewery with a story. Namely, back in 1860, a grain trader called Emanuel Slaghmuylders starts the brewery under the name E. Slaghmuylders. As was accustomed back in those days, he used an initial. Funny side story, he found out that the materials were quite expensive and he branded the barrels with E. Slaghmuylders. So he actually named his sons all names starting with E, and they kept doing this for 3 or 4 generations just so they wouldn't have to replace the materials. As I said, side story. In February of 1860 they pump out the first beer, and yeah, this is a clear pilsner, a lager, and apparently it's quite successful. Now, they put a lot of these barrels, these ES or E. Slaghmuylders barrels in bars, and they leave them there to be filled up every time over and over, so they don't have to use those barrels for transport anymore, because actually they bought cheap barrels and they weren't suited for transport anymore. In 1885, so after 25 years of brewing, Emmanuel dies and one of his sons takes over. I believe this is his oldest son, Ernest. He had several sons, but I believe Ernest takes over. And another 14 years later, in 1899, Ernest marries a woman that was quite well known in the brewers' world. He married Marie van Rooij. Now, this is a well-known name because Van Rooij, Marie, was the sister of Arthur van Rooij. And Arthur van Rooij was a co-founder of Palm Breweries. This was the family Van Rooij from Wieze, and there was also a brewery Van Rooij in Wieze, so she was also a brewer's daughter. And as often is the case, brewers were politicians, and I believe her father or her uncle was even a mayor. So, Ernest and Marie have 5 children. They have 3 sons and 2 daughters, and each of the 3 sons get a name starting with E. Guess why? In the early 1900s, so during the time that the kids are being born and everything, Marie focuses on the kids and Ernest modernizes the brewery. So he puts in the first steam-powered machine, a steam kettle, and a state-of-the-art bottling line, a new cooling system, and a filtration installation. Capacity ramps up and things keep going well. In 1920, they have some extra money left and they buy a piece of land that is attached to the Abbey of St. Cornelius in Ninove. They start making plans and building, but in 1921, so only 1 year later, Ernest passes away and Marie takes the lead in the brewery. Now, as I said, she came from a long line of brewers and she was used to working in a brewery and running a brewery. So she takes over, and 5 years later, in 1926, the new brewery is finished and ready to start brewing. So the 3 sons, Emile, Edmund and Edouard, take it into use and immediately brew a new pilsner with actually a new recipe and a new procedure. They start brewing with low fermentation instead of the always used high fermentation beers, and it's an immediate hit. Now, unfortunately, 1940s come around for Slaghmuylders as well, and they're lucky their brewery isn't seized and is not bombarded, but money's tight for everyone during a war, and they have to go back to high fermentation beers. And why is that a logical step? Because a high fermentation beer requires a lot less cooling, and a lot less cooling means a lot less money. Remember, a low fermentation beer ferments at 12-15 degrees centigrade. A high fermentation beer ferments at about 25 degrees centigrade, so that's about 10-12 degrees less cooling and a lot of energy saved. After the war, they actually keep brewing the high fermentation beers for a while until 1958. Unfortunately, that is 1 year after their mom Marie died in 1957 at the age of 90 years old. So in 1958, the low fermentation beer returns. They start brewing new lagers and helles and everything you want. But a bit later on, in 1965, the next generation takes over. Now, 1965 means the brewery was in existence for 105 years. Each of the three sons, so Emile, Edmond and Edouard, have a son of their own. And they decided not to blindly follow the tradition of the E-namings. So the sons are called Philippe, Évrard and Michel. So only one E. Philippe takes care of the books and the administration. Évrard is the chief for tech and sales. And Michel is a brewer, and he oversees quality and the intake of materials and ingredients. Now, in 1979, Slaghmuylders is asked to brew the Witkap range of beers by this drinks trader from Deurne, who closed down the brewery. And they immediately say yes, they have the capacity, and well, it is a very successful beer, so why wouldn't they? 2 years later, in 1981, the trader decides that he had enough of it, and he sells the beer, the recipe, the portfolio to Slaghmuylders. They happily buy it, and they've been brewing it ever since. One minor detail, in 1981 they did receive an official cease and desist, so they legally had to stop using the name Trappist for the Witkap Pater range of beers. And they did. It's not on there anymore. Fast forward to almost today. In 2012, the other brothers stopped, and Michel is the only one who proceeded with the brewery. Things are still going very well, and in 2019 they basically renewed everything except for the brew house. Everything but the kettle, so a new bottling line, a new cooling system. They replaced a bunch of equipment that they hadn't replaced since 1946, I believe, the steam-powered machines, for example. So they replaced it. They installed a bottling line with steam sterilization, which they didn't have before. Serious health hazards there. We do have this ruling in Belgium called the HACCP, HACCP, or Hazard Analysis of Critical Control Points, and I do believe a non-sterilized bottling line just doesn't cut it anymore. Currently, Michel isn't the brewmaster anymore. Of course, he's the owner, but the brewmaster is Luc Verhagen, and if that name rings a bell for anyone, Yeah, it might, because he used to be a brewing engineer for Brewery Van Rooij in Wieze. So he actually worked for Michelle's grandma, or her parents. He also worked for De Koning, the city brewery in Antwerp, and he also worked for Brewery De Landseer, and De Landseer is the brewery that brews Malheur beers. So yeah, they got some cool people in-house. Actually, talking about in-house, I want to share this one detail from the label with you guys. Belgian family brewery Slaghmuylders is situated intramuros historic abbey site in Ninove. Yeah, they like to boast about being brewed inside the abbey. It's not true. It is brewed on abbey grounds, but it's not inside the abbey, and it has nothing to do with the abbey except for being on the abbey grounds. So, that being said, I absolutely love this label. I absolutely love the simplicity of it, the beautiful branded bottle cap. Yeah, let's taste. My trusted tasting glass, because I couldn't find my Witkap glass. I know I have one somewhere in the attic, but oh, I actually expected a rather crisp and dry smell, but this is very fruity. Very fruity indeed. Even a bit floral. That's a nice surprise. Now, what can I tell you about this beer? This beer is a 6% blonde. I can't tell you very much about it, except that it's brewed with locally sourced hop flowers from Erembodegem near Aalst. And yeah, that's about it. It is very, very active. I see a lot of bubbling, and I see quite a bit of yeast in the bottle. Well, it is a re-fermentation in the bottle, so that's nothing weird, but I am gonna pour this quite carefully. Ooh, that's a lot paler than I'd expect as well. That's like a very pale golden yellow. I do know that there aren't any herbs or spices used in this beer. They actually advertise with that. So that does tell me that there are gonna be some herbal flavors, probably from the hops, and a lot of fruity notes from the esters from the yeast. Lovely dense white head of foam, quite thick foam, very, very tiny bubbles, a lot of pearling, a lot of carbonation in that glass. And although it's a very pale color, it is a rather hazy beer, very light. Ooh. Quite thin mouthfeel. From the first sip, I'd even say a bit watery. Indeed, quite slightly herbal, but mainly quite dry and bitter, like a hoppy bitter. The floral notes that were in the nose seep through in the taste as well. And I do get a bit of, a tiny bit of a buttery taste. Now, a buttery taste isn't rare in beers. It is rare to be added intentionally. But a buttery taste, if I recall well, means that there's too much diacetyl in the beer. Now, this can have many reasons. Diacetyl is actually a compound produced by the yeast in the main fermentation, and normally the yeast breaks it down during the second fermentation or the maturation. And several things can happen for that breakdown not to take place. For example, if your beer is cooled too quickly, so the so-called diacetyl rest isn't present, then you might have some diacetyl left. Another reason that actually happens quite often is not sterilizing your equipment, not working clean. So homebrewers often have a bit too much of diacetyl in their beer. Does this mean that you have to throw it away? No. In fact, in this beer I kind of like it, but this beer is well known for that. If I have a Westmalle triple tasting like butter tomorrow, I'd probably complain. But for this beer, it's not that special. It actually complements the hoppiness and the dryness quite well. I also want to point out that, look at that foam. That is very resilient. It stays up, doesn't dissipate quickly at all. Now, they do call this, and I believe it's somewhere on the bottle here as well, it's not on the bottle, but I think I read it somewhere. They call it a live beer or a living beer with taste evolution. That means that when this is just bottled and fresh, you will have even more diacetyl, and it will taste a bit fresher and a bit less bitter. But the taste evolves during the fermentation on the bottle, and this is an older one, so I get a bit less diacetyl, a bit more bitterness, a bit less aroma. Nonetheless, this is a very well-made beer. Funny thing is that the initial taste is quite aggressive, quite bitter, but you do get this silky soft feeling in the mouth, probably a combination of the diacetyl and the carbon dioxide with those hop aromas. But in the aftertaste, the bitterness immediately fades away, and the floral component stays behind. Yeah. So still a very well made beer. I actually think I told you everything I can tell you about this. Pardon me. So let's just leave it at that. I've already talked about 2 breweries, and otherwise I'm gonna get complaints for making videos that are too long again. So as usual, if you have any side notes, any questions, anything you want to tell me or ask me, go ahead in the comments. If you like this video, hit that thumbs up. If you want to see more, subscribe, hit the bell icon, and you'll get notified whenever I upload something. During November, that will still be that will still be Wednesday, Friday and Sunday. And we're gonna do another advent calendar, so the first 3 weeks of December I'm gonna pump out videos every freaking day. Let's see how that goes. and if I can keep that schedule this year. That being said, cheers you guys, and I'll see you in the next video.